My sister got everything free from my parents: parties, college, $1 million wedding, while I paid rent for my empty room. But when I bought my house, I gave my mother a key. And my sister broke in with her 3 kids and moved in without permission. I called the police. I'm 32 years old. I work in tech. And honestly, I need to get this story off my chest because I've been dealing with this shit my entire life. And just a few months ago, I made the decision that changed everything. Even though my family acts like I committed some terrible crime when all I did was buy myself a house. You know, like normal people do. But I guess I should start from the beginning, so you understand why this is so important to me. I grew up in Texas with my parents and my older sister Heather, who's 35 now. And for as long as I can remember, things were always different for her and for me. I don't know exactly when I realized I was basically the secondary child, but there are moments that stick with you, you know? Like when Heather turned 15 and my parents threw her this massive party, like with an event venue, DJ, a dress that cost I don't know how many thousands of dollars. And I remember being there thinking, wow, this is incredible. And then my 15th birthday came around and they made me a dinner at home with pizza and a cake from the grocery store. And when I asked why I couldn't have a party like Heather's, my mom said something like, "Oh, Chelsea, you're not as social as your sister. We thought you'd prefer something intimate." But the truth is, they never asked me what I wanted. And that's how things always were, basically. Heather would get good grades and they'd reward her with trips, new clothes, whatever. I'd get excellent grades, like better than hers, and I'd get a good job, honey, and that was it. Heather wanted dance classes, singing classes, classes for whatever she could think of, and my parents would pay for everything without thinking twice. I asked for programming classes when I was like 14 because I was interested in computers, and my dad told me I could learn that for free on the internet, that they didn't have the budget for it. But literally 2 weeks later, Heather decided she wanted to learn guitar, and they bought her an $800 guitar and paid for private lessons. At that point, I was like 15 and was starting to understand that this wasn't normal, that there was something fundamentally unequal about how they treated me versus how they treated Heather. When it came time to go to college, things got worse. Heather went first, obviously, and my parents paid for everything, literally everything. Full tuition, dorm, food, books. They even gave her a credit card for expenses. I'd watch her come back on weekends with bags of new clothes and talking about the parties and restaurants she'd go to with her friends, and I thought, well, when I go to college, it'll be the same for me, right? Nope. When I got accepted to university to study computer science, which had always been my dream, my parents sat me down and told me they'd already made a huge sacrifice paying for Heather's college. And now that I was going to, they couldn't cover everything. So I'd have to look for scholarships, student loans, and work while I studied. I was shocked. I told my mom, "But you paid for everything for Heather." And she told me the financial situation had been different then, that I had to understand. But it didn't end there. Turns out while I was in college, living on campus in a shared room and working 20 hours a week at a coffee shop to pay my expenses, my parents decided I had to pay them rent for my old room at home because I was technically still keeping some stuff there. $300 a month. For a room I wasn't even using. Heather never paid a cent of rent, not when she was in college or later when she moved back in with them for 6 months between jobs. But me, who basically had a box of high school memories in that room, had to pay them $300 a month, or take my stuff out and lose my room forever. I paid the rent because I didn't want to completely lose my space in that house, though looking back now, it was stupid. I graduated with honors, 3.9 gigapascals, in a difficult major, like computer science, and my parents took me to dinner at a regular restaurant and gave me $200 as a gift. It was a quiet dinner. Just the 4 of us, and then we went home. When Heather graduated 2 years before me with a 3.2 inches communications, my parents threw her a huge party at the house, with catering, invited all the relatives, gave her a new car. I remember being at that party helping serve food and thinking, this is what's waiting for me too, right? Nope. And when I asked them why my graduation had been so different, my mom told me they'd already spent a lot on Heather's graduation and couldn't do 2 equal parties. And that, besides, I was more reserved and probably preferred something simple. Again, deciding for me what I supposedly preferred. Heather married Eric when she was like 27, and obviously my parents paid for almost the entire wedding. It was at a beautiful venue, with like 200 guests, designer dress, honeymoon in Europe, everything. I was a bridesmaid, and I had to pay for my own dress, shoes, hair and makeup, plus the wedding gift, plus the bachelorette party. I helped organize. I spent like $2,000 total on my sister's wedding. And honestly, at that point, I wasn't even dating anyone seriously, but I remember thinking, when I get married, it'll be at the courthouse because there's no way my parents will pay for another wedding after this. Then Heather and Eric started having kids, and now they have 3. Arya, who's 5, Joshua, who's 4, and Sebastian, who's 2. And don't get me wrong, I love my nephews. They're good kids, but the situation with Heather and Eric is a disaster. Eric works from time to time, like he gets a job, keeps it for 6 months, loses it or quits, and then he's unemployed for another 6 months. Heather stopped working after having Arya and never went back, and my parents basically support them. They pay their rent when they can't cover it, buy them food, buy clothes for the kids, give them money for everything. And Heather acts like all this is normal, like my parents are obligated to support her and her family because she's their daughter, you know what I mean? Meanwhile, I got a good job after graduating. I've been working the last 7 years. I've been moving up. I earn well. I live in a decent apartment that I pay for myself. I have my car that I paid for, my things, my life. And I've been saving because I always knew I wanted to buy a house eventually. Have something of my own, you know? Something nobody could take away from me or decide for me. So, like a year ago, I started seriously looking at houses, talking to banks about mortgage pre-approval, looking at properties online, that kind of thing. This is where everything goes to hell. I hadn't told my family anything about looking for a house because honestly, I didn't want to hear their opinions or have them try to get involved. But I have this coworker, Melissa, who's super gossipy and can't keep her mouth shut about anything. And I made the mistake of mentioning to her that I was looking for a house. I didn't give her details, just told her I was in the process of looking. Well, turns out Melissa lives near where Heather lives. I didn't know that. And one day, she ran into Heather's neighbor at the supermarket, and somehow the topic came up and Melissa told her, "Oh yeah, I know Chelsea, Heather's sister. She's looking for a house." And the neighbor obviously told Heather. And Heather told my mom. And suddenly my phone exploded. My mom called me like 50 times one day, and when I finally answered, she was all excited like, "Oh, honey, Heather told me you're looking for a house. How exciting. Why didn't you tell us? We have so many ideas for you." And I told her that yes, I was exploring options, but there was nothing concrete yet. Big mistake admitting that. Because then my mom and Heather started sending me links to houses. But not just any houses, but huge houses, like 4 or 5 bedrooms, all in the neighborhood where Heather lives or near there, all super expensive, way more than I wanted to spend. And when I told them those houses were too big and too expensive for me, Heather told me not to be silly, that buying a house was an investment, and I had to think big, and that besides it would be super convenient if we lived close so the cousins could grow up together. And that's when I started suspecting this wasn't about me at all. I kept telling them I was fine, that I'd keep looking on my own, but they wouldn't stop sending links and messages. One day, Heather called me and told me straight up, "Chelsea, listen, Eric and I are going through a tough time financially, as always, and the house we're in now is getting too small with the 3 kids. So I thought, if you buy a big house, we could move in with you for a while until our situation improves. It would be perfect. And that way the kids would have more space and you'd have help with the payments." I stayed quiet for a moment because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told her no, that I was looking for a house for myself, not to have roommates, much less to support 4 additional people. She got angry and told me I was selfish, that family helps each other, that mom and dad had always helped her and now it was my turn to help her. I hung up that call and decided right then that whatever I did with my house would be completely secret. I kept looking, but I stopped responding to my mom and Heather's messages about houses. I just told them I was still exploring and would let them know when I had something concrete. Meanwhile, I found a perfect house for me. A small cottage-type house. Just 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, kitchen, and living room, with a little garden, in a quiet neighborhood like 45 minutes from where Heather lives. It was perfect. It was within my budget. It was cozy, and it was mine. I did all the negotiating, the paperwork, the inspection, everything without telling anyone in my family. I closed on the purchase on a Tuesday in August and officially became a homeowner. I waited like 2 weeks to tell them. I knew there was going to be drama, but I didn't know how much. We went to dinner at my parents' house on a Sunday. It was a normal family dinner with Heather, Eric, the kids, my parents, and me. After dinner, when we were in the living room, my mom brought up the topic. So, Chelsea, how's the house search going? And I took a deep breath and said, Oh, actually, I already bought a house. I moved in last week. The silence that followed was intense. My mom looked at me like I'd told her I'd killed someone. Heather jumped up and screamed, What? You already bought? Without telling us anything? My dad asked, What house, where, and I told them about my cottage. I told them it was 2 bedrooms, that it was in another neighborhood, that it was perfect for me. Heather exploded. She started screaming about how I could be so selfish, that she'd sent me options for perfect big houses where we could live, together, that I knew she needed help, that 2 bedrooms wasn't enough for anyone. My mom joined in, saying I should have consulted them on such an important decision, that they're my family and had a right to give their opinion, that buying a house wasn't something you do in secret. Eric was sitting there not saying anything but looking angry, like I'd personally taken something away from him. I told them it was my money, my decision, my life, and that the house was for me alone, not for the whole family. Heather said I was a horrible sister, that she'd always been there for me. Total lie, but whatever. And now that she needed something, I was turning my back on her. My mom said she was disappointed in me, that that's not how they raise their daughters, that family supports each other. My dad at least tried to be calmer and said he understood it was my decision, but I should have been more open with them during the process. I told them they had to get used to me making my own decisions, without their input, grabbed my bag and left. The kids were crying because the adults were yelling, and I felt bad about that, but I needed to get out of there. What followed was a harassment campaign that lasted weeks. Constant text messages from my mom, from Heather, even from Eric, who almost never talked to me, calls at all hours. Long voicemails from my mom crying, saying how could I do this to her, that they only wanted the best for me, that Heather really needed help and I was abandoning her. Heather would send me photos of her kids with messages like, Your nephews miss you. Don't you care? My parents started posting things on Facebook indirectly about the importance of family and how some children forget where they come from, that kind of passive-aggressive shit that older people do on social media. I ignored everything for a couple weeks, thinking eventually they'd calm down. They didn't calm down. One day, I was at my apartment, because I still hadn't finished moving completely, to the new house, and someone knocked on the door. I opened it, and it was Heather with all 3 kids, with suitcases. She told me she and Eric had argued, that she needed to stay with me a few days, that she had nowhere to go. I knew it was a lie. I knew she could stay with my parents, but I also knew that if I let her in, she'd never leave. I told her no, that she couldn't stay with me. She started crying right there in the hallway, saying I was her sister. How could I deny her help? What was she supposed to do with 3 kids? The kids started crying too, because obviously they were confused and scared. It was horrible, but I held my ground. I told her to call Mom and Dad, that they had space for her. I closed the door and heard her cry and yell at me from outside for like 10 minutes before she finally left. That night, I made a drastic decision. I changed my phone number. I blocked my entire family on all social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, everything. I sent them a message from my old number before changing it, saying I needed space, that I wasn't going to respond to any more messages, and that when I was ready to talk, I'd contact them. Obviously, they didn't like that at all. They started sending me emails, which I also blocked. My mom tried to contact me through a cousin, asking her to tell me to please talk to her. I didn't respond. Like 2 weeks after changing my number, on a Saturday afternoon, someone knocked on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole, and it was my mom. Alone. She looked calm, had something in her hands. I hesitated a lot but finally opened. She smiled and said, Hi, honey. I know you're angry, but I brought your favorite pie. Can we talk? I thought maybe she was finally going to be reasonable, so I let her in. She sat on my couch, gave me the pie, and started with a speech about how she understood I needed my space, that she respected my independence, that she just wanted to make sure I was okay. She sounded sincere. It sounded like a real apology. I softened a little. We talked for like an hour. It was a pretty normal conversation. She asked about my work, about the new house. I told her some details. I showed her photos of the house on my phone. She said it looked very nice, very cozy, perfect for me. She asked for the address because she wanted to send me something for the house, a plant or something. I was still being cautious, but I gave it to her. She left after a while, hugged me, said she loved me, all very normal. I thought, well, maybe things are calming down, maybe she understood. How naive I was. What I didn't know until later is that while we were talking and I was in the kitchen making coffee, she saw my keys on the table, including the spare key to my new house, and took it. She literally stole it from my apartment. And she also made a mental note of all the details of the house I'd shown her in the photos, the address, everything. A week later, I had a long day at work. I got to the new house around 7 p.m., and when I opened the door, I froze. There was noise inside. Voices, footsteps. I walked in slowly and found Heather in my kitchen, unpacking boxes. Eric was in the living room setting up a baby playpen. The 3 kids were running around everywhere. There were suitcases in the hallway, their furniture against the walls. I stood there, unable to process what I was seeing. Heather saw me and smiled, like nothing was wrong. She said, "Oh, hi, Chelsea. You're home. We were getting settled. Mom gave us the key. She said there wouldn't be a problem." I exploded. I screamed, "What the hell were they doing in my house? How dare they enter like this? To get out immediately." Eric told me to calm down, that it was temporary. They just needed a place while they found something. Heather said I had 2 bedrooms and only used one, that it was ridiculous for me to live alone in a house when they had 3 kids living cramped in a small apartment, that it was the least I could do for my family. I told them they had 5 minutes to get their stuff out and leave before I called the police. Heather laughed. Said I wouldn't call the police on my own family? To stop the drama? I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Heather's face completely changed. She said I was crazy, that she was my sister. How could I do that to her? I talked to the operator, said there were people who had entered my house without permission, that I needed them removed, gave my address. Eric started picking up things hurriedly, telling Heather we had to go, but Heather just stood there yelling at me that I was the worst person she knew, that I was destroying the family, that our parents were going to be devastated. The police arrived in like 10 minutes. I explained the situation, showed them the documents that the house was mine, told them these people had entered without my permission using a stolen key. Heather tried to tell them she was my sister, that I'd invited them, that it was a family misunderstanding. The officers were professional, told her that regardless of family relationship, this was trespassing, that they had to leave immediately or they'd be arrested. Eric already had the kids in the car. Heather kept screaming, but they finally left. One of the officers recommended I change the locks immediately and consider a restraining order if the harassment continued. He gave me a card with a case number in case I needed legal reference. That same night, I hired an emergency locksmith to change all the locks. It cost double because it was nighttime service, but I didn't care. While the locksmith worked, I was shaking, like I couldn't believe my own family had done that. The next day, I went to see a lawyer. I told him the whole situation, from the lifelong favoritism to the house incident. The lawyer helped me draft cease and desist letters for my mom, Heather, and Eric, warning that any other attempt at unwanted contact or entry to my property would result in immediate legal action. The letters were sent by certified mail. My parents called the lawyer because they no longer had my number, yelling about how I dared threaten them legally, that they were my parents, that this was insane. The lawyer told them very calmly that there was documentation of trespassing, harassment, and theft, and that if they wanted to avoid criminal charges, they should stop contacting me. I haven't heard anything from them since. Well, that's not totally true. I know from a distant cousin I didn't block that Heather and Eric had to move in with my parents because they couldn't pay the rent on their apartment. So now there are 7 people living in that house? And apparently it's total chaos. My cousin told me my mom complains constantly, but can't kick Heather out because she's her daughter and has grandchildren. Part of me feels sorry. But honestly, most of me thinks they deserve it. I've been living in my house, my perfect little 2-bedroom house, for 5 months, and it's the peace I've needed for years. I don't have to deal with favoritism. I don't have to hear about how I'm selfish for having boundaries. I don't have to explain to anyone why I deserve to have my own things. I've been going to therapy because all this left me pretty affected. Like I have trust issues now, and sometimes I feel guilty for having cut contact with my entire family. But my therapist keeps reminding me that setting boundaries isn't being a bad person. It's taking care of yourself. Last week, I painted the living room a beautiful light blue, planted flowers in the garden, and adopted a cat named Oliver. I work from home 2 days a week, and on those days I make coffee in my own kitchen, work at my own desk, in my own house, that nobody can take away from me or use as an excuse to manipulate me. And that's enough for now, I guess.